This is Judaism Unbound, episode 452, Yom Kippur, Jewish Theories of Change. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And first things first, Shana Tova. Rosh Hashanah was last week, Yom Kippur is this weekend, and we're wishing you a good year. Hopefully a better year than the one that just ended, which has been a really difficult one. We hope you had some meaningful moments as the new Jewish year began, and we hope Yom Kippur can offer you some additional meaningful and unbound moments as well. We're releasing this episode on the morning of the day that Yom Kippur begins, which this year is Friday, and we do it regardless because our episodes always come out on Fridays, but we're also doing it because Yom Kippur, as it turns out, has been the single day in each of the past 2 years with by far the most listens to our podcast. Just from the download numbers, we can see that as much as some Jews don't use electronics on Yom Kippur, a lot of others do. And clearly, many unbound Jews, perhaps including you, have a Yom Kippur practice of diving into Jewish learning on this day, whether or not they're also taking part in a Yom Kippur service at synagogue. So if this is you, we're honored that you're spending part of your Yom Kippur with us. We're really excited about today's episode as our annual Yom Kippur episode. You might remember that 2 years ago, we talked with Dan Pink about regret, and last year we talked to Danya Ruttenberg about repentance and repair, and this year our guest is Rachel Cohen, who's a policy correspondent for Vox Media. She's a reporter who focuses on U.S. social policy, and she recently wrote a thought-provoking and very Jewish article that grabbed our attention entitled Why I Changed My Mind About Volunteering. It struck us as the perfect conversation to have at a time of year focused on looking back and then looking ahead, changing our minds, and then taking action based on that change. You can find the link to Rachel Cohen's article in the show notes for this episode, and we encourage you to read it as a companion to this episode. Another quick reminder before we dive into this episode that our Yeshiva, the Digital Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning, has some truly awesome new courses that are open to registration right now. There's Fierce Women of Torah with Alicia Jo Rabins, who we've been trying to get to come teach a class at the Yeshiva for years. And also the Rambam's Theology, that's Maimonides, taught by Lainey Solomon, an incredible teacher whose day job is at our beloved Svara. And then there's Jewish Communities in Africa, Asia, and the New World, taught by one of our favorite podcast guests ever, Juan Mejia. And finally, Gender in Judaism, Tradition and Transformation, taught by the incredible Jewish studies scholar, Sarah Imhoff. Financial aid is available for all these classes, and you can find all the info you need to register at judaismunbound.com/classes. So let's talk to Rachel Cohen about why she changed her mind about volunteering. Rachel Cohen is a journalist based in Washington, D.C., where she keeps a close eye on the politics influencing policy development and the leaders, activists, and researchers spearheading those ideas. Rachel Cohen writes about housing, education, childcare, abortion politics, economic policy. She has been covering social policy issues in D.C. for more than a decade, with reporting published in more than 24 national outlets, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, Bloomberg, The Daily Beast, The Washington Post, and, of course, Vox. So, Rachel Cohen, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm so excited to talk about this essay you wrote, and I've brought this up before on this podcast, and it's an area that you talk about in your piece, which is kind of climate. And we've talked about this before in the podcast, that we have folks coming on and saying, really, the only thing that is really going to make a difference for climate is to be protesting in the streets against fossil fuel companies and things of that nature. And I've had a contrary impulse, and I've expressed the contrary impulse that says it's really, really important for Judaism, in our case, to make it clear to people, in other words, even if it wasn't already true of Judaism, that we need to add this to Judaism. I think it might be there already, but that we have to have a sense that we have an obligation to recycle, for example. Not because I think that recycling my newspaper or whatever it is going to save the world, but because of a hunch that the people that are out there protesting against the fossil fuel companies probably recycle in their personal life, that there's something about cultivating that sense of doing this in a small way in my own life that those are the people that kind of creates the pool of people that we can say, okay, now you could do even more. Just as a little anecdote, I just got a new car. It's a plug-in hybrid. And what's interesting is that I was so excited that I wasn't going to use gas. And the truth is that this hybrid, this plug-in hybrid, mostly sits in our garage. It turns out that we don't drive very much. And so what is it really doing? And yet, I feel really good about having this car. I feel really good about even going on my 2-mile trip to the grocery store and back and not using any gas. And I know it's not really solving the world's problems,
Right.
and yet somehow it feels significant to me. So I'm wondering if you could describe the exploration that you did and what you started to conclude from it.
Yeah. You mentioned the word obligation to recycle. And one thing that I didn't explore in my essay, but I've been thinking about a lot, and I think it connects to this idea around tzedakah and obligation, is there's volunteering. That is a conversation that's been going on. And, I think about that in the essay. But something that I think is also part of this is there's volunteering of the type that I'm talking about, of like, let me carve out some time and how do I kind of be part of this world and what should I do to make the world a better place? But then there's like obligatory service, or less coming entirely from internal motivation to do good and more like we're following this code. And whether that's legally or sort of tied to your national identity or your religious code of how to live, and maybe religion just kind of makes that a little easier, where if you are struggling to find all the internal motivation to do these things, like it can be helpful to have just a bit of like, well, this is your obligation. You have to do these things. Like you need to do these things, and trying to find the voluntary volunteering and sort of like obligatory doing good, doing mitzvahs, doing service, I think is really interesting. And I guess the other thing I would say on that, I think it does fit in with a lot of the, well, what is service? What counts as service? Does service have to be for a stranger? Could service be for your child or your mother? And I think that also blends with this question about obligation in interesting ways, because obviously we do feel duty to our family in more intense ways than often we feel to our communities or our countries. But there have been times, certainly in history in the world, where people feel very strong duty and obligation to their country or their communities, more than I think we do in this present 2024, hyper individualistic world.
So we're releasing this episode as Yom Kippur is approaching. There are some people out there who are scarfing down their pre-fast meal, and this is playing in their kitchen. People experience, not just us, but like deep dives into podcasts and media as Jewish ones, as a form of Yom Kippur practice. So I want to really go there, and it's maybe a little overwhelming, but I kind of want to talk about the axis of self versus community versus world. Like it's a huge thing, maybe one of the basic human questions that we've been wrestling with for thousands of years, but it's Yom Kippur, so that's what we're meditating on. And in particular, I'm thinking of the Haftorah reading. It's Isaiah 58, and the premise of this chapter and what is said is basically, look, Jews, it's not about depriving your body of food. That's not what this is. The point, and this is what it says directly, is to basically approach wickedness and feed the hungry and let those who are oppressed be free. And what I think is so interesting about that is two different people with different mindsets about theory of change could read the exact same Haftorah that says it's not about how you as an individual fast, it's about feeding the hungry, it's about letting the oppressed go free, in diametrically opposed ways in terms of whether that's a teaching about how we should be volunteering and versus whether it is saying we should be solving the problem of hunger systemically. And I'm saying versus on purpose because I think we treat it that way. We treat this as a duality. And everybody's response is always, well, no, it's not a duality. But I think subconsciously we still lean as people towards change that is not systemic versus trying to solve the underlying policies that create hunger. I guess I'm just curious, how does Yom Kippur fit into this for you? That's not what your article was about, but this is a moment in the year where we're thinking about how to change as selves, but we also word the liturgy in the plural So it is also simultaneously about how we change as communities. And I'm curious if you can help us navigate the both and of that, or the tensions in that, all of those pieces.
I studied sociology in college and political science, and I've been writing about policy in Washington, D.C. for 10 years. I went, and as I said, I sort of went to college in the decade when I feel like a lot of these ideas were really crystallizing and becoming so prominent about what is real change. How do you make a real difference? What is ineffective? What might actually be detrimental to the kind of work you're trying to do? And I really absorbed and internalized a lot of these arguments, and I really believed most of them. I'm starting to realize, like, I don't think we're actually going to be able to make the change that we want to make systemically if we're not also being on guard and proactively trying to do these things in our own individual lives. Because what's happening is people are getting depressed and cynical and nihilistic and disengaged and losing hope. And there's this world where you can imagine people all aligning on the final policy goals they want to see and all sort of agreeing on that. But like what it takes to get there requires, a lot of work and sort of often years of fighting. And in terms of like strengthening communities to get the change that we need, I guess I just think we've underrated the consequences to not living our lives in these sort of small do-good ways, and how that actually helps collectively over time builds up a world where we're not getting closer to this bigger reforms and systemic change that we want to see. And that's frustrating and disappointing. And I don't think anyone can really look around, especially when you read how people say they're feeling and what people say they're dealing with their mental health, and say like, yeah, we're really on a right track here. This is really the direction we want to go. So I guess for Yom Kippur, it sounds corny to say these things are connected, but I actually really do think they are. And I do think for like a decade, for a long time, we've been saying there are two different kinds of people do these different things. And if you want to be an effective person, you're going to go down this path. And I don't really think the effectiveness model is super good, but if you are stuck to it, then maybe you should also consider that maybe it's not actually as effective as you thought without trying to travail both paths.
Your article reflects very much on your and my shared generation, millennials. I read it and really felt it as somebody. You and I met through Jewish activist circles, a lot of my own social networks, age-wise and politics-wise, and I don't know, whatever like social norms are similar to what you described. And there's a piece of what you talked about of how, and I think that in Jewish life, it's a blind spot. We talk so much about tikkun olam, about repairing the world. That is overwhelming. I'm proud of that, right?
Right.
It's so important, and not every religious tradition does that. There are many other religious traditions, and forget religious, there are many other societal norms where thinking about the self and not the world writ large is more normalized. Yeah. But there's not a globally circulated, super popularized Jewish two-word phrase for like what I might call tikkun shechuna, like repairing your neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Or I actually think that
that's interesting.
We haven't enshrined connecting to your neighborhood. There are Jews who think of like connecting to a synagogue or connecting to a local Jewish community as something that is like a Jewish value. I don't think that we have codified for Jews globally or in a lot of places that it is a Jewish act to commit not only to like the world, but to bettering a local context. And every political activist from whatever stripe will tell you like, you gotta do those local kinds of changes if you're gonna achieve the systems or national changes. And I know a lot of people, Jews and otherwise, it's not just Jews, who like the election that they think about, singular, is the presidential election.
Right.
And they might be living in a place for multiple years. I'm in Rhode Island, which is a deeply blue state. And in a presidential election, it is never gonna, in the near future, going to be anything other than Democrat. And so I have people who have lived here for multiple years and are technically breaking the law, but like they're still registered in a state they grew up in that is a battleground. And they don't vote in any of the local elections in that state. They only vote in the presidential election, and they can't vote in Rhode Island because they're not registered here. And so it is very directly a commitment to a national level and to some degree international level that is on some level at the expense of the local level. There's lots of things in Rhode Island that would benefit from progressive voices. And so I kind of wanted to ask you about that. Like, there is the level of the individual, there is the level of the world. How might we think about this as it connects to like local communities? Because I think honestly on Yom Kippur, as we're reflecting on what we as Jews are doing well and we aren't, I think we're kind of missing on commitments to our local communities that are not just our local Jewish institutions.
Oh man, there's so much there. That was I actually went to this class, which is very unusual for me, but I was with a friend who invited me, and it was at Sixth and I Synagogue in DC, and it was sort of this thinking about how to make meaning out of the high holidays. And, you know, one of the things that the rabbi who led it was talking about is how Rosh Hashanah is sort of this birthday of the world, how it's this like really this Jewish particular day, but to celebrate the universe and the world, and how that's kind of unusual because a lot of Jewish holidays are about like the Jewish community or Jewish feelings or Jewish experiences, but this is sort of this outwardly focused world birthday thing that's a little, you know, I didn't even really put together Tikkun Olam and Rosh Hashanah as both being like these whole world type purview. And I think it gets to your point that we do have this tendency, this tradition, I don't know what the right word is, that of looking either at the world or looking at the Jewish community. And maybe that's built up around some anti-Semitism or being displaced and for whatever reasons, but there's like this idea that the Jewish community within the local community is where the locus of attention often goes in those ways. And obviously there are a lot of Jewish institutions that do try to do like things within the broader community, but I think you're right that there's just, it doesn't feel like it has that same sense of obligation. Even as we talk about obligation to the world, we have this exact same thing in Washington, D.C., in Maryland. There's all these people who work for the federal government, all these people work in politics and advocacy and lobbying and all these things. And so few people follow the DC Council. And we don't even have a, you know, governor. We don't even have a legislature. And the disconnect between people who are paying attention to local politics in this city of, you know, 700, 800,000 people is really striking. And it's not helpful to just be like, you need to pay attention to even more because people are feeling so overwhelmed. Like, that's not always a helpful thing to just be like, well, you're just not following enough things. But I do think I got this note from a reader about my essay, which I really liked. And he said, it's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting. Ooh. And I think I'm just realizing like how we actually spend our time, like what we literally schedule in, prioritize in the course of a week or a month is so important and means so much more than just like what you think you would vote for on a, should you be in power to make that decision. And yeah, I guess I'm struggling with this question about obligation. And yeah, I would love to hear if you have any other thoughts on that.
I love that quote from the reader. I don't know if is that original or
I don't know.
It's
sure.
Great. I mean, it's easier to act to a new way of thinking than to think to a new way of acting. It's think your way to a new way of acting. That's awesome. It connects to that. I want to pursue this idea of tshuva because that's often translated as repentance, and then you feel like it's about sin. But some of our guests over the last few weeks, particularly, I think it was Kashira Halev Fife, really focused us on that the real translation of teshuva is return, and the idea of annually returning to a certain place is another interesting way to think about it. And I don't know, in my mind right now, it's like a return to beginner's mind, right? A return to just some starting point. And every year we go back to the starting point to see if we still want to stay on this path. And it's not about sin, it's about mistaken ideas. There's nothing like morally wrong about it necessarily, but it was a mistaken idea. Like I would very much like for supply side economics believers to do tshuva. And what I mean by that is not that they've done a horrible sin and caused harm. That may also be true. But what I want them to say is like, that actually just doesn't work. You know, it turned out it was wrong. The whole theory of supply side economics, otherwise known as trickle down economics, right, is that if you cut taxes, then the people are going to put their money into productive uses that are going to create jobs, that are going to do all kinds of things. But instead, they tend to hoard it. So it's just a mistake to think that that is going to work. And what I got from your article, and I would love for you to share this more deeply, is a sense that there's almost a very resonant mistake that we have been making as far as tikkun olam goes. The idea seems to be it doesn't change the world enough when you just do these little acts of virtue, of tzedakah, righteousness, charity, whatever you want to call it. Instead, we should be working on these grand problems. But it turns out that when people stop doing their smaller acts of kindness, that's not going into some bank that is then being used to do all these big acts of world changing. And so it's a mistaken notion that feels to me like we haven't done tshuva about, in the sense of just returning back to ask ourselves, is this true or not? And I felt your article really helped us analyze that. So could you share a little bit about what you found?
I sort of opened my piece with this idea when looking back at me as a child and activities that I did regularly, and whether it was with Jewish community or just with my school and family. But over time, those childhood activities started to look, childish. And I think this is something that people experience with a lot of things we did, like art projects, drawing, coloring, like certain acts people start to associate, oh, that's for children. And in terms of like getting older and like thinking back, well, is that right? Is that true? I think just like with creativity, these other ideas of like, why did I stop doing those? And I should say, like, a lot of this has been motivated for me in part also as I think about parenthood and becoming a parent, which I'm not yet, but it's certainly like in my hopes for the next couple of years. What am I going to do with them in this area? And do I do something with them I don't believe in, or do I believe in it? Why did I stop? And I'm kind of feeling very humble about everything I'm saying, because I'm like, wow, I don't know. I guess things are changing, and I guess everything looks different with time and different place in life. And that sounds really corny, but I feel glad that both our secular calendar and our Jewish calendar and our life cycles or whatever have these kind of built-in stages to sort of stop and look back. And I feel grateful for Teshuva, I guess, this year.
Could you share with our listeners just some of what you write in the article in terms of perhaps some of these mistaken beliefs that I think a lot of us, we're talking about people that have the political beliefs, that Lex and I have. And I think we're talking about ourselves. Yeah. And this was where I read your article and said, whoa, I've been operating under a mistaken belief, was that you talk about how you interviewed somebody who said, actually, it's not clear that there has been a decline necessarily in charitable giving, because a lot of immigrants, for example, are sending tremendous amounts of money to their family outside the country. And I read that and I said, well, that's not really charity. That's self-interest. You're just helping out your family. Like, isn't that kind of a form of self-help rather than what I think of as charity? And then pretty quickly, you guided me here, but pretty quickly I felt like it doesn't show love of a stranger, but maybe showing love of your family is the first step toward an understanding of going beyond your lone self. These weren't people buying themselves new cars, right? These are people that were giving the money to their families. So hopefully those folks will widen their circle of responsibility, a sense of obligation, of responsibility, a sense of loving the stranger. But and we have in Judaism, right, this famous quote, right? Rabbi Akiva says it's the greatest principle of the Torah that you should love your neighbor as yourself, which means that you have to love yourself in order to be able to love your neighbor, among other things. So I appreciated you sort of guiding me towards some tshuva from mistaken thinking and more valuing that support of your own family. But I'm curious what else you found in the article that you think really sort of demonstrates that we've been under false ideas.
Yeah, well, for me, one of them was this basic idea that individual action is at best kind of unproductive, not helpful. At worst, it's actually detrimental to the bigger change we want to make. It's actually a distraction. It's like what people in power want you to be doing so that you're not out there doing like the real important work. We're all focusing more on powers of billionaires, Bernie Sanders campaign and Occupy Wall Street. there's grains of truth into some of these arguments. Like, it is obviously true that, shopping at Whole Foods or carrying a tote bag is not going to stop climate change. And it is true that the government needs to do its part. But you have a lot of people really, really downplaying, dismissing the value of changing your diet, even though like the top science, top research on all this climate stuff shows how much of a difference that would make, especially if a lot of people make it together. One of the most popular sort of statistics said online, in the last 8 years was that 70% of the world's emissions is made by like 100 companies. That completely discounts the way that companies respond to what people are asking for and buying. And I just want to respond to what you said about family, because I think maybe partly as a result of the important conversations we've all been having around intergenerational wealth and kind of like family power, we have developed a rather uncharitable, if you will, way of talking about the act of caring for your family. And there's sort of this like distrustful motive that it's all about like trying to keep and maintain power. Caring for your aging parent or caring for a baby or caring for your sick, anyone, like we all know that is like that requires so much care and love and is not and you have to be very selfless. And there is sort of this interesting tension, I think, where we have this idea that like if it's for someone you don't know far away, it is more selfless. It is a higher act of generosity and care than if you are, if you have a child with special needs and you're day in and day out taking care of them. Like, how did we kind of get to a world? And I think sometimes the way we kind of treat parents who are struggling, it's like, well, you decided to have that kid anyway. Why would you do that? And we sort of take it out of the community way of looking at, of just like creating a world that's hospitable and caring for kids. And maybe this goes back to what Lex was talking about earlier with like how we think about the individual, role versus the communal role and the local role, like how we think about raising families and caring for seniors and all these things has become so individualized especially in the US, but sort of ironically to this point where we don't even see those people as being really generous. We're like, and that's why I was really, really moved when I was reporting this article by talking with this retired sociologist named Paul Skirvich, who actually before he became an academic, was a Jesuit priest. So he sort of brought a lot of that theology to his research. And he was like, just talks about philia or non-romantic love and how there's value to just seeing the love for your family as really related to the love of why we would care about someone in Gaza or, in South Dakota or down the street. And thinking about how we rank all of these things is, I haven't figured out yet, but I have been like very agitated about it for a year.
I want to sit with this. I mean, here's what's clear to me about the three of us in this conversation, and I think pretty much all of our listeners probably. We're interested in forms of individual level action and change. That's important. I also do think, like, part of me does still have the thoughts that we're pushing back on or that you're pushing back on in this article. Like, I want it to be clear that for me, and maybe I'm not speaking for all three of us, when I read your piece, what I read it as is not, hey, systems thinkers, hey, institution level change thinkers. Dan, I appreciate what you said about like doing teshuva, but like for me, the folks who are thoroughly on the only systems change is worthwhile front should do teshuva, should do reorientation work, and no less the people who are really buckled into the individual level without wanting to focus on the policy level, on the institutional level, should do teshuva. Like I want it not to come through to our listeners that we're like calling for one end of this. Like as I read your article, you're speaking as somebody who holds deep reverence or love for systems level change, saying that's not 100% of the story. Like the last few minutes, I think we've said some useful things, like, but I'll be frank, like I don't think it would be good if we translated that phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, as love your brother as yourself. The phrase "ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha" in Hebrew, the word can sort of hint at love your kinsman. I think that's how it was often translated until the last, I don't know, 100 years. Loves your kinsman as yourself. And there are commentators, Jewishly, who use that phrase that a lot of us think of as a very universalist phrase to say, you should help your fellow Jew. You could even have somebody read it theoretically in a world where they read it as brother, as what it came up because of what we were talking about with like sending money to our family versus to others. I support both of those things very deeply. I do think that we have a bigger problem with people being taught and socializing one another that looking out for one's nuclear family and to some degree extended family is kind of the whole thing. Like, I'm still with activists on that front. I want to voice that because I don't want the takeaway to be that we're like recanting all the things we've said on our podcast, including all the things I've said about how we do need to get beyond that which is closest to us by blood or by like the people we know. Like, I do actually want people to help the person in Gaza and South Dakota to a not that much less extent than their actual family members. And I want to turn now to the question of blood donation. That came into your piece. What's interesting is there are ways in which certain kinds of organ donation, like direct family members, are actually like needed. But like, you spoke in your article about the imperative for blood donation, which, as an aside, is another area of repair that our world needs to do, because we currently have policies that drastically limit who is able to give blood because of historic queer phobia. And that's gotten a little better, the policies have over the past few years, but it's still harming huge numbers of people who could receive blood and are not able to because of blood shortages that are contributed to by banning a bunch of people with perfectly healthy blood from donating. But on that front, the people who are sitting next to me at the blood donation place tend to be very different from me. They tend to be much older, as far as I can tell, and sometimes they tell me very conservative politically, and it aligns with what you said in your article. And so, as much as we're calling on people to do the work of thinking about their family, thinking about those they do know, thinking about the individual level, the act of blood donation, it's another one you could define either way. Like, on some level, I'm helping one solitary person each time I give, like literally, it only goes to one person. Or you could say that when I give blood, I actually daven, I pray the morning service, and I hone in on the Ashrei prayer that includes the sentence Poteach et yadecha umasbia lechol chai ratzon, which says, you open your hand and all that lives is served. That is not about an individual person. It's about lechol chai, like all that is alive. I am actually enshrining my connection to all that lives by having the blood in my body end up not in my body, but in some strangers. And that's breaking down the barrier between self and other. Can you talk to us about the blood donation side and also the balance between, we're not just saying stop with the systems, we're saying hold both?
Yeah, definitely saying hold both. Where I landed, I was like, how do we get closer to the world we want to build and that we want to live in, that I would want to raise kids in? Like, what needs to happen to get there? And I'm still writing about policy. I still believe these are the things that like we need to move the lever, but I think that we're not going to be able to actually, I think we're not moving in that direction without these other, like, you do need both. And that for the blood donation question, it's interesting as you were talking, and I didn't really think about this when I was writing, but it suddenly just popped in and feels very clear. The way that I think we would want to think about blood donation, sort of interesting, and I'm puzzling why we don't, is just the way that we think about vaccines, which is something you do. I mean, not exactly like vaccines, but I think especially during COVID, it really became clear, like, we're taking all these measures for everybody else because that's the right thing to do, because that's how you take care of one another in a society that's like has different levels of vulnerability and need, and healthy people can take measures for less healthy people, and we can ask that of one another. And when I was thinking about why I never given blood, and I was sort of going through reasons in my head, and I was like, are these just excuses? Like, how much of this is my fault? Probably a lot of it. But, like, I was trying to be like, what's a reasonable factor here? And I was reading about how a lot of employers don't do blood drives anymore. Now they've switched to remote work or partial remote work, or there's all these different things. But I came across a study as I was researching that said the most common reason people donate blood for the first time is because somebody asked them to or invited them, or friend, and that's very similar to voting. And then blood donation becomes a habit, which is also very similar to voting. So it's all about ways that you can create habits, even though then they often end up being something that maybe you continue on your own, but maybe not. It is easier if there's a blood drive and it's at a place where you're going to be, like your school or something. And And I guess there's a practical question of how would we maybe increase blood donation in the US? And I think we can probably all have some good ideas about how you might do that. But there's like this other more maybe Yom Kippur Jewish question about like, why are we not thinking about blood donation like we think about other acts of service or getting vaccinated? And it even feels, I don't know if you guys, it even feels like in a different category than like recycling. Like they just feel so different in these ways that I don't quite know exactly how to articulate. I think people do like to step up and be helpful. And it's so, I mean, I have a family member who is in remission from leukemia, and that's not why I did it. But it is really eye-opening when you just start to realize what those sorts of acts actually do. And it's not just like a abstract thing. And maybe there's more, everyone could do to make those choices clear to people. But we still need to figure out a way that it's not just for the highly motivated, voluntaristic people to do. And there needs to be some sort of obligatory sense, maybe some sort of sense of duty that ties into how we take care of each other. I will say I've never felt more like healthy. It was such a it was a very unexpected feeling for me. Like the feeling of leaving the blood donation center and like, having the little snacks and walking out, I just felt very like vigorous. It was a very strange, new kind of healthy feeling. And I was like, wow, I think a lot of people would enjoy feeling like this. It feels great. And you can help people who are not healthy. I don't know. There was a lot of things going on that I wasn't expecting from the experience. So highly recommend it if anyone's listening on the fence.
I want to get a little bit theological, like that might not have been your thought today, but like the past 3 to 4 years, and including my work on the high holidays, my like introspection work, I've realized that my pantheism, my relationship to the notion that God is not separate from me, but that God is the sum total of all matter. You and I and this computer screen and the phone people are listening on are all part of a collective oneness that is God. Folks will forgive me if this feels very spirity or woo in ways that are uncomfortable, but I genuinely think it. That motivates a lot of how I do everything. And what that does is it totally explodes the notion that I, Lex, as a self, am anything other than part of the whole beast that is the universe. So if I put a Band-Aid on my finger, that is healing a small, small, small part of the universe, which is the part that is my finger. That is what motivates me when I give blood, because it's a mental reminder that like literally my body isn't mine. Like it's not a me. It can leave me and become somebody else, like actually scientifically. That's not spirity, or that's like a literal thing that can happen. And then everybody walking past the person who receives my blood will not think, oh, there's a little bit of Lex in it. They'll see it as that person. But I wanted to talk about what you said, which is that you felt really healthy. You felt really good leaving the blood center. In the same communities we've been talking about, it is not always a point for volunteering or for blood donation or for anything else that it feels good. And I actually think this might be like subtly Protestant or Christian. Like, not that everybody doing this is Christian, but like we've really internalized the idea that what it is to do the ultimate goods in the world is to sacrifice of oneself. And that, of course, like the biggest example of that is Jesus giving of himself in the world's most hegemonic religion for the sake of others, right? Like that is how a lot of people are taught to think about what it is to be and do good in the world. When acts like blood donation or whatever feel good, that actually subconsciously or consciously tells us that they might be farther away from the ultimate goods. The ultimate goods are things like, I don't know, getting arrested for the purposes of a cause where it's not pleasurable to be arrested. In no way is that like a happy experience. And I think that we on the left would benefit to think about how we've really followed that notion that if something feels good, we should be inherently skeptical of it. And what's funny is blood donation, it doesn't feel like the act of it. The first time I gave blood in high school at a blood drive at my school, in the ways you were talking about, that's often the gateway, I didn't get through it. And so that blood did not go to anyone. I'm somebody who likes competition and challenge. And so I think that's part of what got me in the first place. And I think that might not be good, because I think we actually need to learn that sometimes that which makes us happy and joyful is what's needed, and it doesn't always have to be hard. So can you talk to us about that axis of like of feeling good actually being a point against volunteering from some folks, and why that might not be right?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think a direct corollary to that point is this idea that all the activities that we associate, and maybe this is a gendered thing. I think women listeners will know where I'm coming from, but like so many of our self-care activities are about buying something or getting clothes or a boutique fitness class or some kind of like manicure or just like things by yourself. And we have, in the way that I think you are identifying that, yeah, there's sort of a discomfort in saying like that you could feel good from volunteering. We also have coalesced on this idea that self-care, caring for yourself, is not found in helping other people. It's not found in like doing service for the stranger or your family, that it has to be something, doing these things that I think we all know are not actually true. Like, yes, exercise, that's good for you, but like maybe you're not actually going to feel as good from these various activities as actually helping someone. And we just have kind of like we've lost the plot, or lost the reminder, I think, to people that like, if you're feeling down, maybe you need to get up and go do something. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, I'm trying to like act my way into this new way of thinking. But for people who are like, I am thinking on this, I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. Like, I'm not sure what I really think. Like, I was in this mind space when I emailed a rabbi. I emailed Sarah Krinsky. She works at Addis Israel. And she's the one who told me this Naaseh V'Nishma story. And she said something like, DC people are overthink everything, want to have everything figured out before you do something. And she actually, making the point that you don't have to have it all figured out before you take a step in. And that's kind of
just to clarify, that's what Naaseh V'Nishma means. Like, you will do, followed by you will understand, in that order.
Sorry, yes.
Well, a lot of what we've traditionally done on this show is think about new rituals, new ways of observing a holiday. And it strikes me in listening to this last part of the conversation that to the extent that people are out there, including me, who generally don't fast on Yom Kippur, that to donate blood feels almost like a form of a fast. Like if that, and the reason why I don't fast is like, I don't find it meaningful to me. It doesn't work for me. It hasn't worked for me in that idea of the act so that you'll change your mind rather than think so that you'll change your actions. It hasn't worked for me. And I wonder, I'll see if I can make this happen, but I wonder if donating blood on Yom Kippur would feel like a form of fast that actually was meaningful.
Just sorry to interrupt, but I think you could literally, just throwing the rabbi hat on for a second. Like, first off, I'd note again, like, for people who are ineligible, potentially for reasons of queer phobia, but also for other reasons, the ritual could also be of agitation for change to those policies that we have that forbid certain forms of blood from being donated, even when it's healthy. I will note that there's been success on that front. There used to be if you're a man who's ever had sex with a man, that's the gendering they use, and it also applies to trans folks. It used to be a lifelong blood ban. That's not the case anymore, but there still are celibacy requirements of a certain, I think, 3-month duration, which endanger the world, in my opinion, because they endanger the lives of people who have fewer eligible folks out there able to give. So you could A, donate your time to agitation to change that, and B, also, the notion of afflicting yourself, the Hebrew invokes the word soul, like nefesh, and it says in Genesis that like the blood is where the nefesh is, like the soul is in the blood. And so I actually think that you could make a very direct, non-stretchy argument that an action of afflicting your soul is to give blood. Not that it's afflicting. We just talked about how it feels good. But anyway.
Interesting. Well, then your conversation too earlier about the blood donation, I was thinking, offline, I was having a conversation with previous guest Ron Wolfson, who was talking about how, I guess there's I think Nobel Prize winning economist who is the one that came up with the idea of kidney donation, where if you need a kidney donation, you could have a loved one donate a kidney to a stranger. and that kind of jumps you on the line to get a kidney match from a stranger. And that actually that has caused a great increase in kidney donations. And that's really where I kind of end up on this question, Lex, earlier that you were talking about, like, yeah, of course, we're not saying that we should give to our family to the exclusion of giving to others or caring about others. The question that I'm interested in pursuing here is, what if it turns out that the only way for most people in our society to truly become people who love strangers, right? Who, when you say love your neighbor as yourself, you're talking about not your Jewish co-religionist or your literal brother or whatever, that we're talking about effectively strangers or members of the society that are not in our most intimate form of community. That what if it turns out that the only way to really get people to do that is to cultivate doing it for themselves, for their family, their nuclear family, and their smaller circle community, you know, fellow Jews in this case. I have a sneaking suspicion that this is true. I don't necessarily want it to be true, but if it turns out that it's true, then I feel like there's some tshuva to be done. Again, not in the sin sort of way, but in the rethinking and the saying, okay, given that, how might we better leverage that truth for the benefit of everyone?
There is research that shows there is an aspect about habit formation and maybe the sense of obligation that comes. As you were talking about kidney donation, I started to think about the fact, and I don't really know what I think about this, and just like, but I do know that Orthodox Jews donate kidneys at higher rates than like every other group. And so there's something like in activist circles, they talk about mutual circles of care. And so that's kind of a similar idea here. But the other thing your thoughts made me think of is I don't think it's unrelated that my own journey, rethinking, revisiting, recalibrating around how I want to engage and help and serve my local community, my world, my whole community, was coinciding with me thinking about how do I want to be a parent one day, and like what do I want to teach my child. And so I think there is these lines between your most immediate circle does shape how you look outwards. And obviously there are worlds where people then only look inwards or use their immediate circles to justify not looking outwards, but it absolutely can inspire the more generative, expansive view that I think all of us want.
Thank you so much, Rachel Cohen, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. Also, to those of you listening the day of the release of this episode or the day after, wishing you a meaningful Yom Kippur, Chag Sameach. Some people think you're not supposed to say Chag Sameach because it means happy holiday on this day, and Yom Kippur is supposed to be solemn. It's not really wrong, traditionally. You can still say Chag Sameach, even if it's not quite a Chag in the pilgrimage festival sense. It is still a day that is not just supposed to be solemn, and we hope that you're experiencing it in a way that feels right for you, whether that involves fasting or not, whether that involves synagogue attendance or not. Whatever your Yom Kippur is, we hope it is proving special, and we are thrilled that this episode played a role in it. So thanks for listening extra if you are incorporating it into your observance of this day. And also to those of you listening after Yom Kippur, amazing as well. We hope that this has spoken to you and allowed you to reflect on this Yom Kippur and maybe even look forward to future Yom Kippurs. We want to remind y'all that if this episode was meaningful, if our work is meaningful, you can dive into it even more. We have classes starting in just a couple weeks in the Anya Yeshiva, our digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning. You can head to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more and register. There's financial aid available for any of them, and we've got an amazing slate of teachers this time around, and, generally. But head to judaismunbound.com/classes for more. We also encourage you to be in touch with us with any ideas or questions or comments you have on this episode or our work generally. You can do so via our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. There's our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. And we'd love to give a special shout out to our website today, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, resources from past years for the high holiday season for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which maybe will speak to you as you observe the day. And also you can just find out more about our work and the Anya Yeshiva. So judaismunbound.com for that. We are also deeply appreciative to those who are able to support us with a financial donation, which you can do at judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just via a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. Chag Sameach, Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova, Groovy Teshuvi, my favorite Yom Kippur reading. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.